everyone need a break before we move into Committee of the Whole?
I'm blocked too.
No?
Who are you?
Well,
Okay.
not completely by the pillar, but by the flag.
Oh, shoot.
See,
Yeah.
Okay, good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the December 6th, 2018 Assembly Committee of the Whole work session agenda. The time is approximately 6:56. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Lejeski.
here.
Mr. Tacky.
Here.
Ms. Williams.
Here?
Mr. Quist.
Here.
Ms. Light.
Here.
Mr. Gray.
Here.
Ms. Sanford.
Here.
Mr. Cooper.
Here.
And Ms. Major.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Okay, so before we begin, I just want to make sure that in the event of an emergency, everyone understands where the exits are. So we have an exit straight in front of us that goes out to the parking lot. We also have an exit to my right, and if you're sitting in the audience, your left, and then also on my left, and if you're in the audience, on your right. So with that, we'll begin, and we'll start this evening with the Interior Alaska Natural Gas Utility Board quarterly update by IGU representatives to include a question and answer period.
Thank you. Good evening. For the record, my name is Dan Britton. I'm the General Manager for the Interior Gas Utility and have been the President and CEO of Fairbanks Natural Gas since the year 2000. I apologize this evening. The Chair, Throop, is unable to attend. She's dealing with an emergency, family emergency out of town. So I apologize that the Chair is unable to be here tonight. We'll walk you through some of the things we've been working on in the last quarter and some of the major projects that we're working on right now and have in the hopper to be started shortly. So just as a reminder, the Interior Energy Project purpose is to bring low-cost energy to as many residents and businesses of Interior Alaska as possible, as soon as possible. Stabilize the economy and help improve air quality. Some of the recent activities, we completed audits for both the Interior Gas Utility and Pentex Alaska Natural Gas Company, whom the IGU purchased in September of 2018. The Trial Road storage project, a 5.25 million gallon storage project that I'll provide a little more detail on later in the presentation, is ongoing, currently on schedule. We are developing a North Pole storage facility to be able to bring gas to the previously installed pipes that the Interior Gas Utility built in 2015. We're at about a 65% design and budgeting with that, with the schedule for completion of the design work by the end of the year, and then we'll begin to bid that work. Siemens Government Technologies has proposed an alternative LNG supply solution to the Interior Gas Utility. We're in negotiations and discussions with Siemens on what that supply might look like and whether it is a potential alternative source of LNG for the utility. Concurrently, we're evaluating the expansion of the Titan LNG facility that IGU owns that provides LNG to the utility now, to Fairbanks Natural Gas. It's located in Point McKenzie, produces currently about 50,000 gallons of LNG per day. But as we expand customer base, we need additional LNG supply as well. So as we evaluate Siemens, we're also putting together the final front-end engineering design and the scope approach that would provide the desired security of supply to the utility as well. So we're finalizing the security of supply analysis that will help us craft the scope for the engineering of the expansion of that facility. Ultimately, we'll look to select the supply source that provides the greatest cost benefits and other benefits to the utility and our customers. We've recently hired additional employees in preparation for continued growth and expansion of the utility. The large storage project, hopefully many of you have seen the project going on. If you've driven down Van Horn Road by Pegger lately, you should notice a large structure that never used to be there, and it's a great project for our community. It's what one of our directors called the heart of the interior energy plan. It provides us with increased level of security of supply and an ability to begin adding customers again when the tank is completed, which is scheduled for the fall of 2019. We started construction in January. We're on schedule with a completion date the fall of 2019. The current status of that project is the outer tank is complete. They are working on the inner tank right now. The balance of plant work that we started, which includes our multi-purpose building, pipe trenches, our new offload facilities, is pretty much complete. It's in the final touch-up stages. We had a 3B work, a phase 3, which was additional civil activities that's been completed, and the new offload ramps are in use with our current storage facility. So the importance of the project schedule is to have it online and available to meet the commercial operation prior to the end of 2019, so that this project could qualify for the storage tax credits that are currently available through the through the state of Alaska. Those credits could be up to $15 million. It's 50% of the project or $15 million, whichever is less. Just a shot of some of the what the facility looks like. What you're looking at here is a pipe trench that you can see the grading, and the structure there is the vaporizer support. We're installing 3 vaporizers that convert the liquefied natural gas to gas. Those units will have enough capacity for the expansion for the next 10 years of adding customer growth. The design basis for this facility called for a high level of security of supply, so we have 3 50% capacity units, so we have a spare capacity if the event there was problems with one of the units. The same holds true for our pumps in the tank. We have 300% capacity units and multi-levels of redundancy in the facility. The tank itself is about 100 feet high and 100 feet in diameter, just to put it into perspective. Our ability to meet the schedule was contingent on getting the outer tank completed prior to the start of winter. So the outer tank now is essentially our shop as we work on the inner tank. We've got heaters that are on in the inner tank. They're able to keep the climate in there about 50, 55 degrees, so it's a comfortable work environment as they build the inner tank. What you see here is the steel that's going on is 9% nickel steel. It's a low temperature alloy that will deal with the cryogenic temperatures, which is minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit. And they've completed the first 3 rings and are currently working on the 4th row of plate. And again, on schedule, they're anticipating having a 5th row of plate up before they leave for Christmas break. This is a new multi-purpose building that's been installed. This will house the heating source for the vaporizer, the control equipment for the rest of the facilities. There'll be our control room and our boiler room, air compressors for our valve controls, nitrogen generators, etc. So this is the main building structure for the facility. Just a quick shot of the inside. We've started to receive some of the major equipment. The boilers arrived and are now sitting in the building. We received the pumps for the storage tank just this week, and so our major pieces of equipment are all starting to arrive on time in preparation for their final installation. The other project I mentioned was the North Pole storage. This is a smaller facility that will mimic what Fairbanks Natural Gas has historically had in the past. The capacity of this will be about 150,000 gallons. What we're doing is moving 2 of the existing tanks that will be replaced by the large tank we just looked at, moving those from their location into North Pole. So we have a we'll have a temporary storage solution until we're able to take those out of service in the summer of 2020. So we'll, again, the construction schedule for this facility is for the summer of 2019 to be in commercial operation by the end of 2019 to also qualify for the LNG storage tax credits. There may be some future additional storage added at this location for Golden Valley. Golden Valley is still interested in being a consumer of natural gas for their LM6000 generator that's in North Pole. And at that point, we would add additional storage, either similar but smaller to the one we saw, the 5 million gallon tank, or additional shop-built storage tanks, which would be about 75,000 gallons each. Our next steps in the immediate term, one of the individuals that we brought online, or positions we added, was a focus on customer service and conversion. That person is making sure that our natural gas conversion program will be in place when we can begin to add new customers in 2020. We'll continue the implementation of combined utility, combining the Fairbanks natural gas and interior gas utility. Likely at some point you'll see just a single utility name and all operations will be combined. Was that a question? Sorry. Oh, sorry. We'll continue to participate. One of our directors has participated on the air quality stakeholders group. The board continues to advance IGU policies. The North Pole storage final investment decision, we'll look to bring that to our board of directors in the first part of January. And then the LNG supply option finalization between the Siemens or the utility-built project at the Titan expansion. And with that, there's a lot of information related to the interior energy project on the IGU website and still on the ADA website. They've still got a lot of information there if anybody is interested. As always, we would like to remind everybody, if you're doing any activities with digging, please call 811 before you dig. Natural gas pipelines are becoming more and more prevalent in our community, and please call. We'll provide free locates to locate those if you're doing any digging activity. And I'm available for any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Britton. We'll open it up for questions or assembly discussion. Mr. Lejeski.
Are the newspaper reports of the durability of Titan true? No major, no major damage?
I am pleased to report that there was no major damage at the Titan facility. We lost power, as did most everybody else in the area, for about 6 hours. We do have backup power generation at the facility, but that's for life safety and our controls. It's not large enough to run the facility. So we took that time to do our thorough inspections, and as soon as the power was back online, we brought the plant back online. So it was running that day. We had minimal supply disruption as far as hours of delay related to the transportation. We did have several trucks on the road at the time of the earthquake. We halted their movement while we evaluated what the road's conditions were. But once all the reports came in, we were able to move them again. We generally take Vine Road. I'm sure many of you saw that Vine Road received substantial damage, but we have alternative routes and continued to take those. So the facility performed extremely well. Our employees performed extremely well, and we're ecstatic that we continued operation.
Ms. Williams?
So once the large storage tank is finished, hopefully by December 31st, then what happens?
So we'll fill the tank. The tank, given its capacity of 5 million gallons, what it allows us to do is to operate our current liquefaction capacity more steady state. Right now, we liquefy to our peak, and then in the summertime, because our usage drops off so much, we have to shut the facility down because we don't have anywhere to put the LNG. With the tank now, we'll continue to run the facility, fill the tank in the summertime, and then be able to draw it down in the wintertime. So we'll be able to add additional firm customers. So even without additional LNG supplies, we'll be able to add approximately 50% to our current sales volume, so which is about 400,000 MCF of additional sales. And to put that in perspective, that's approximately 2,600 residential customers. Ultimate number of customers will be dependent on the makeup, commercial versus residential, but just.
Thank you. So you mentioned that you had hired some additional employees in addition to the conversion manager. What other positions do you have now?
Yeah, we just recently hired a director of operations. That individual will start the first week of January. What that position does is a couple of things for us. One is it provides for a greater level of redundancy in the event there's a problem that I have an issue. It also provides for some future potential for succession planning, and allows for a greater level of focus on growth from my perspective.
Thank you.
Okay, Mayor Ward.
Yes, I got a few questions. One of them is there anticipated to be a CNG facility at the new tank?
We have a CNG facility right now at our other storage site, our storage site number 1, which is just off of Shack Road. We have a station that we use for our own purposes. We have a couple of CNG vehicles in our fleet that we fill there. We have an LNG fueling station also at that location. We do have 2 trucks that we lease back to our contract trucking company that are powered by liquefied natural gas. So the new tank we hadn't planned to put CNG there, but we could put CNG anywhere on our system. It doesn't need to be adjacent to a tank.
Okay. 2 more questions. This is in regards to the funding package. On the SETS funds, how much SETS funding is still left? And then I have a question on bonding.
Okay. With the SETS funding, once the Fairbanks storage facility is complete, there'll be about $10 million of SETS funds available. So the North Pole, between the Fairbanks storage and the North Pole storage facility, the SETS funds will be depleted. We'll have used all of those funds.
And then on the bonding package, I believe is it roughly $100 million in bonding that was authorized? I don't have the exact number, but is ADA the guarantor on that one, on that bond proposal?
So that the bonds available to the project's $150 million of bonds, and what there are is moral obligation bonds from the state of Alaska. So the project will be responsible for the payment of that debt, but it will have the moral obligation of the state of Alaska that backs those bonds. ADA will be the one that facilitates the placement.
Thank you.
Mr. Lejeski.
So with the 50% increase of ability to deliver LNG to customers, is that going to be firm or interruptible or equal? Multiply the 50% times the firm and the interruptible.
So the firm, that's firm capacity. So we have been and continue to add interruptible customers right now, and we'll do so in the future to the extent customers want that. But the 50% addition is firm capacity.
Great. So that's 50% increase with no new trucks, no new supply, no new LNG, cooling facilities. It's just, okay.
Yeah, rather than us delivering 1 truck of LNG a day in the summer and 6 in the winter, we'll deliver 5 to 6 every day until the tank is full. And then we'll use the tank to supplement our firm supply in the winter, so we'll have those additional available supplies and then refill it in the summer.
And I just wanted to give you public kudos for the performance of the plant, because I know you personally had a lot to do with how that plant was designed and built back when, you were with FNG as a private manager of that. So,
thank you. We have an excellent crew of individuals that work with us, for us, down at that location too. Our plant manager has actually been there since before the plant existed. He was one of the individuals that helped build it stick by stick, and so it's just a real testament to those people, and thank you very much.
Okay, any further, Mr. Christ?
Thank you. You mentioned that you're currently in discussion with Siemens considering an alternative source of LNG. And also, your presentation said that in the immediate term that you're looking to make a decision as to what the source of LNG would be going forward. And I was hoping you could just talk about that a little bit more, please.
Sure. So the general plan and scope that was agreed to previously between ADA and the Interior Gas Utility was for the utility to expand the Titan liquefaction facility, and that's still one of our options that we're evaluating. The other that's become that we're evaluating is the Siemens government group put forward an unsolicited proposal that looks like it might have some potential. So we're going through that process of looking at those. We're looking, likely decision would be in the July of 2019 timeframe, between which option is the best choice for the utility and our customers.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or discussion? Okay, seeing none. Next, we will have a presentation by community planning staff and Shelley Wade of Agnew Beck regarding the Sulcha Badger Sub-Area Plan, community input, draft goals, outreach, and timeline to include a question and answer period.
Bear with me for just a moment while I pull up my PowerPoint here. Want to say anything? Thank you. My name's Kellen Spillman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Community Planning Department. And joining me today, I have Melissa Kellner, who's the Long-Range Planner with the Community Planning Department. Also on this project, we have a consultant. We have Agnew Beck Consulting Firm out of Anchorage that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting on this project. Unfortunately, Shelley Wade could not join us today, but she will be before this body for another update, potentially in the future, and the plan adoption if this ever gets to that point. So for tonight's presentation, it's going to be a higher level presentation. We are just getting to the point in this planning process that we're starting to disseminate goals and actually implementation measures, things like a land use map for the area. So I'll go over that a little more in depth, but really kind of the purpose of a sub-area plan is to give an area of a community kind of a unique opportunity to tell us as the government what's important for them, to have an actual plan emphasizing their values, kind of their goals for the area to guide growth in that area. And this area, kind of the Sulcha area to Badger Road area, which I'll show some maps in a second, is a very unique area of our community. And the reason why we're doing this planning effort right now, I'm sure everyone on the Assembly's heard that we're expecting quite a bit of population growth associated with 2 squadrons of F-35 fighters coming to Eielson Air Force Base. And in working with Eielson, we've disseminated that very few of that population growth is actually expected to live on base. So the vast majority of that, approximately 3,300 people, are expected to come to the community and live off base. So kind of the first crack at this, kind of the higher level plan, if you will, was the Eielson Regional Growth Plan. I look at this as kind of phase 2 of that project, a much more specific plan, specifically related to land use, transportation, etc. But through that Eielson Regional Growth Plan, we learned that about 85% of the existing off-base residents for Eielson staff are in that 99705 area code, which is North Pole and kind of the greater North Pole area. And we really do expect that to continue through this growth associated with the F-35. So roughly 85% of those 3,300 people we'd expect to live in that area. So why this plan now? Really, a lot of it's associated with that population growth, but again, really giving this community a unique opportunity. There's some unique challenges and some unique opportunities in this area. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the geographic area, and I've included in your addendum the PowerPoint slide. So if you can't see this map, I apologize. Should be in front of you. We crafted this area really aimed at the area highest impacted by this population growth. So roughly what you're seeing here, and to orient you a little bit to the slide, that green area you see is Badger Road. So this is Badger Road kind of up here on the north end of the slide, continuing all the way down to the south to the Salcha River with Eielson Air Force Base kind of right there in the middle. But the aim of this was to get roughly a 20-minute commute shed of Eielson's front gate. That's what the EIS, the Environmental Impact Study, stated for the Eielson F-35s, and that's what we aim to encompass in this study area, is roughly a 20-minute commute shed. So there's various kind of incorporated and unincorporated communities here. Obviously, the city of North Pole, you can see in the planning area, the Badger Road area, and then kind of the unique communities of Moose Creek, Eielson Farm Road, and of course Salcha. So where are we at and where have we been? We kicked this project off in February of 2018. A lot of this project's being driven by a working group. And we do have assembly representation on the working group. Mayor Ward has also been involved throughout the formation of the working group. It's a 19-member group made up of a lot of residents of the area, business owners of the area. We have 2 fire chiefs in the area, really kind of guiding the development of this plan. And we're expecting a kind of a draft final plan the end of March, maybe into April, that eventually would be before this body for adoption as part of the comprehensive plan. So what we've been doing most of the summer is really kind of outreach, gathering input and gathering opinions of agencies, businesses, property owners in the area. We actually sent every single property owner in the area an individual mailer about this, directing them back to our website, completing surveys, etc., really to try to see what that community valued most about it and what they felt could be improved the most. One challenge we've been wrestling with, and we wrestle with this borough-wide, not just in the area, is there's a lot of plans. There's a lot of plans for the area. Which plan's still relevant? Which plan's not still relevant? State statute points back to the comprehensive plan as kind of the document that guides the planning and zoning in the area. So our intention in this planning effort is to officially adopt this sub-area plan as an element of the comprehensive plan. So this will be, if adopted, the official comprehensive plan for the Salcha Badger area. And we've taken into account and are taking into account all these other plans. North Pole Land Use Plan, Eielson Regional Growth Plan, the FMATS Transportation Plan, which is being proposed for adoption later this month. A little bit, again, about the process. A lot of it's being driven by that working group. We've had 5 meetings so far. All the meetings have lasted at least 3 hours. You can see in some of the photos up here, we've gone through 3 different charrette processes with both the working group and public open houses. We've had 2 public open houses, one down in Salcha and one at the North Pole Library, where we invited the public to, work through some of these charrette exercises. Where should the growth occur in the area? Where are areas that are potentially environmentally sensitive that we wouldn't necessarily want to direct some of the growth to? So I think it's been a really good process. We've toured several of the ongoing projects. Growth is already happening out there. You can see down in the bottom corner right there, that's a attached fourplex that's going up in North Pole. So there's some great opportunities to go along with some of the challenges we have here. Again, public process. We had a booth at the fair, really focused on this. We did kind of a mini charrette process there at the fair that anyone at the fair could kind of work through some of the same exercises, take the surveys. We've received over 200 responses so far from area residents in our surveys. And we heard that, online wasn't necessarily the best way to reach out to people, particularly in Salcha. So we had hard copy surveys at the Salcha Senior Center. We had one of our meetings down there at the Salcha Senior Center. And, I want to point this out too. You see down in the bottom corner, that's an interactive map we actually built for this project. You could go on the website, salchabadgerplan.com, put little dots on the interactive map about areas you think, anything you want to say. We've created several categories: housing, land use, transportation categories. If there's intersections you think are problem intersections, you could identify them in that interactive map. I want to talk a little bit about what the data is kind of showing us, a little bit about the data we've researched into, and a little bit about what the public's telling us so far. So the data, we started with some census data on this, and we had a census in 2000 and obviously another census in 2010. This was the fastest growing area in the borough in that time. The whole area as general grew by about 16%, but I want to point out particularly around the city of North Pole, we had census tracts grow by almost 50% of population. We saw a huge increase in population in this area from 2000 to 2010. We haven't had another census since 2010, so we don't have a complete count, but we've devised some methodologies to kind of estimate what the population's been doing since then, including the American Community Survey. And it seemed to have leveled off a little bit in the area, but we still do have areas, particularly in the city of North Pole and directly around the city of North Pole, that are continuing to grow. And that whole big project area I showed you, about 75% of the population is concentrated mostly in that Badger Road, city of North Pole area. I mentioned methodologies. This is a heat map. The borough is the agency that issues addresses. So anyone wishing to get a power hookup has to come to the borough and get a street address. And that's what we found one of the best methodologies for assessing where growth is occurring. And this is a heat map of the whole borough. And you can see one really hot spot right there in the middle of the city of North Pole. So by far, that's where we've issued the most addresses since the year 2012. So this gives us a really good indication that a lot of the population we're seeing growing. The borough's remained relatively constant since 2010, but the North Pole area is still continuing to grow. We started this process off with a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. A lot of this was being driven by the working group, but also we got so much of this from our survey results. And I want to just hit high level kind of some of the SWOT results. Some of the things we've heard about strengths: a lot of the community really emphasized that small town feel, open space, access to recreation, including trails, and just general privacy. Weaknesses, water contamination, obviously, and this body's obviously heard a lot about the air quality in the area. Opportunities, this population growth obviously is a great opportunity, but a big one that a lot of this is playing off of is the expansion of the North Pole water system. There's some great opportunities with development around that, even looking at a lot of our zoning regulations around the expansion of the water line. And then obviously threats. I talked a little bit about air quality, and then just some of this population growth, if not done properly, it could affect what the community values, that small town feel, that kind of rural character of life. And this is kind of the first time we're kind of showing this. This is obviously in draft form still. I want to go through really high level kind of some of the focus areas we've been looking at in this plan and some of the draft goals and strategies. So none of this has been kind of by the working group yet. We did some high level conversations, but we're having a really big working group meeting next Wednesday that we're going to discuss in depth these focus areas and goals and opportunities. So this is the vision statement that we're kind of working with right now. We got a lot of these emphasis from the public and from the working group. There's two I want to point out here, though, that we're taking very seriously in this planning effort, and that's small town feel. And then you won't see this in a lot of vision statements for any plans anywhere, really emphasizing that respect for personal freedoms. We heard a lot about the emphasis on private property rights for this area, and at the consultant staff level, we thought that was so important that we did put that in the draft vision statement. Again, one of the focus areas is land use, and kind of one of the draft goals we're working off of here is really kind of that trade-off between the personal freedoms that the community feels is so important and minimizing the land use conflicts we've seen out in the area. An example I like to bring up is, and as assembly members, you may have heard about this, you may have received emails about this, a shooting range that opened in the area, very close to residential dwelling units, that was completely allowable in the zoning at the time, and that kind of just really, I think, epitomizes one of the land use conflicts that could and continues to exist out in the area. Transportation. This is taken this plan's taken a deep dive into the transportation in the area. And what we've heard so far and what a lot of the data is telling us, we pulled quite a bit of statistics, a lot of the accident data from DOT and from the troopers in the area to analyze the transportation system. And in general, the major transportation system's doing pretty well. We've modeled all the highways in the area with the expected growth, and it's expected that the capacity of the highways is going to remain pretty good throughout the life of this plan. With that said, there's been some emphasis on the local streets, though. A lot of the local kind of subdivision type roads in the area, we've heard that aren't necessarily the best quality. We've had a number of subdivisions go in without putting in roads, and just the general maintenance of the roads. A lot of the roads in the area aren't in rural service areas, aren't in a city, so there's really no agency to maintain the road. It's really left up to the neighbors to kind of get together and maintain the road, or not, depending on the neighborhood. Housing's a big aspect of this, obviously, that we need housing to accommodate this population growth, but not only that, we need a diversity in housing. The housing stock's very variable in the area, and this plan specifically, it's looking into a couple of things like energy efficiency. Maybe there's something we can do in our zoning code to encourage energy efficiency in some of these houses, or even basic kind of health and safety standards, because most of the area does not have a building code. Most of it is outside of the city of North Pole, and the borough does not have a building code. So kind of next steps, the public involvement is still very much going on throughout this process. After we vet a lot of the draft goals, really get the feedback from the working group next week, we intend on having 2 open houses at the end of January, one out in Salcha again and one in the city of North Pole. We intend on sending mailers out to every single property owner again, as well as Representative Wilson has volunteered to help us kind of give outreach to her constituents as part of this planning effort. But that's kind of the immediate next step. We're going on a little bit of a road show next week. We have a meeting with the North Pole City Council that we're going to give a very similar presentation to, a meeting before the Planning Commission. We went to FMATS this week. And it's just going to continue, particularly the involvement's going to be so key when we get the draft goals and strategies and even the future land use map of this area to really see what the public thinks, really ask them, did we hit the mark or did we miss the mark on this? So with that, I already mentioned the upcoming community meetings, and this body, obviously, if anything's adopted, we have to go back to this body. This body's going to get a couple more cracks at this. So the project website, you see it down at the bottom, salchabadgerplan.com. We've been doing some updates. There's an email list you can subscribe to it on that, as well as the interactive tools I've already mentioned. And again, I'm the project manager from the borough level, and Shelley Wade, who will be before this body through adoption, is the project manager at Agnew Beck. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that any members of the assembly may have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Spillman. So we will open it up for questions and discussion. First up, I have Mr. Gray.
Sure. So this is just kind of a curious question. I'm going to bring up air quality, everybody's favorite topic. And I don't know if there's been any work done on this, either estimation or modeling what the actual impact on the kind of the North Pole area airshed is going to be. I mean, worst case, best case, depending on where people concentrate. I mean, I don't know if anyone has any actual idea of what the impact is going to be to air quality in the North Pole area, but be kind of interested to know.
That's a good question. We've not gone into that depth, into the modeling depth as part of this planning process. Air quality is obviously going to be a big aspect of this plan. But one thing we're starting to see is we're starting to see opportunities. We're starting to see density opportunities. And a lot of that, we were actually really looking at our zoning code with the new water line going in. There's opportunities with smaller lot sizes, and most of the zoning around the area requires 1 acre lot size minimums. So we have opportunities to look at smaller lot sizes that could accommodate potentially multifamily development. The fourplex I showed you in the photo there, that went in North Pole. It was all 5-star plus rated, and there were no solid fuel burning devices installations as part of that.
Great. Thank you.
Other questions or discussion? Mr. Tacky.
So, do you feel like you've had a lot of community involvement? Like, how would you rate it? Would you look for more, or?
I'd say pretty good at this point. We got over 200 responses for the survey, and just kind of the general merit mailers, we got a lot of responses back. The open house in Salcha was actually very, very well attended. The open house in North Pole was a little bit less, but we're expecting kind of the big push over the next month and a half here for the draft plan, the draft goals, if you will.
Excellent, thanks.
Okay, anyone else? Question or discussion? Okay, seeing none, thank you. And next we will have a code enforcement update by the administration to include a question and answer period.
So again, I'm Kellen Spillman, Deputy Director. With me, I have Brian Zamel, who is the single code enforcement officer for the whole Fairbanks North Star Borough, and he's going to be giving kind of the bulk of this presentation.
So the reason you're all here, right, for this presentation. So I am Brian Zamel. I am the code enforcement officer and planner in community planning as well. Go over our agenda quickly, do a little introduction. I know a lot of people don't think of enforcement as something that, first pops in your mind when you move to Fairbanks. So we'll go over the process, some statistics, a few case studies, the cleanup fund, some challenges, solutions, and your questions. Code Enforcement Office is part of community planning, and we support other departments by citations. We investigate complaints, enforce violations, including within the cities. That's just for zoning. We don't do building stuff. Serve the public, work with property owners, coordinate with other departments and agencies. And of course, everybody thinks of, protecting the public health, safety, and welfare, but we like to expand that into protecting private property rights and property values, minimizing conflicts between neighbors and incompatible land uses. And we do strive for fair, consistent, timely, and transparent handling of cases and encourage voluntary compliance. I am authorized to enforce all of the Fairbanks North Star Borough Code except animal control and truancy. But of that, we actively enforce like abandoned vehicles, encroachments, floodplain, zoning code, and mobile home parks. There are technically 3 code enforcement officers. Obviously, the air quality one is no longer relevant. And the garbage and solid waste has kind of a narrow focus, mostly if people are illegally dumping at the transfer sites, that kind of stuff. The process is, so we receive a complaint, somebody comes into the office, maybe they've submitted something via email. We are primarily complaint driven. We're not just out patrolling, although we do now technically have the ability to initiate complaints as well, but we don't choose to exercise that. We then open a case or update an existing case, do some research, go out, inspect the property, see what do we see, get the other side of the story, try to make some contact with folks. Then move into voluntary compliance, so that soft approach of verbal deadlines. Maybe we start working into some letters and some cleanup plans. And then going into some more formal stuff, a notice to corrects and citations, and then ultimately referring it to legal for injunctive relief and court orders. And actually, if we were to issue 2 citations in a calendar year to an individual, then we would have to then forward that up to our legal department for further action. So we can't just keep finding somebody indefinitely, racking up a bill on them. We do try to obviously have that respectful approach, just out of decency, but then also I prefer not to be shot. There are a couple important assembly actions that occurred in the last couple years that, again, were both important, but they did have a direct impact on the number of complaints we've received over the past couple years. First, there was an ordinance in 2016, and it relaxed the complainant restrictions. And so before that, somebody had to prove that they had standing. So they didn't have any anonymity from that. They had to prove that they had an interest that was different than, somebody just driving by on their way to work. So usually that meant you basically had to be the next door neighbor. And so a lot of people weren't really comfortable with that. So that was relaxed. And then there was a resolution in 2017 for supporting code enforcement via priorities developed from the administration, and then also funding that active code enforcement program. And that included litigation and physically correcting land use actions. Land use violations. So now to jump a little bit into the statistics, you can see from 1983 to 2018, this is basically our best guess of how many cases we've opened up per fiscal year in that time. And you'll see a couple that are circled in yellow that might pop out as unprecedented numbers in the last couple years, about double of what that blue best fit line at about 55 cases would be. And a couple more things I wanted to point out was, so that standing I was talking about was added in 2011, and so you can see there was a dramatic drop in cases that were opened as a result. And then once the standing was removed, then there was a much more pronounced escalation in complaints that came in. The only other comparable year we even had was when the zoning ordinance first came into being in 1988. One thing important too is, you've probably seen some of our graphs in the past, and we do bounce around between cases and complaints. It's much more fair to judge things by how many complaints we've received, because you're still, there may be an existing case for somebody who comes in, but you're still triggering a response. Maybe we do a new site inspection, we send out another letter, have some more contact with them. And each one of those is, a counter interaction, some sort of contact with those folks too. So we don't, though, just track all of the inquiries we get and call them complaints. I mean, it has to be somebody, we're clear that, yeah, you want to make a complaint on this, and we'll move forward with it. So a couple years to point out here. The green on the top is 2017, and then the yellow is 2018. And even though it's a bit below that, you can see it's on the same general trend, much above the prior 2 years there. So you can see, certainly could argue that green line was some pent-up demand for complaints, but yeah, again, in general, the trend has continued. Take a little closer look over the last 2 years of new complaints, new cases, cases closed, and open cases. One thing I wanted to point out was you'll notice a pretty dramatic difference in the cases closed. So part of that is we did a case audit in 2016, 2017, inspected basically all the cases that we had. So that was like 100 junkyards, 200 sites, and we're able to close a bunch of cases as a result. So took those off the docket. We didn't have to worry about them. But then in 2018, we were also just trying to work the cases and we're trying to work the active ones rather than worry so much about closing the cases. But two other things I wanted to point out was in 2017 to 18, we had almost 350 new complaints and almost 250 new cases. And when your total caseload is 350 and there's 250 that are new, that's pretty significant. To break it down a little bit more for 2017, 2018, a comparison between the 2 years, wanted to point out that you can see the vast majority of our complaints happen in the summertime. And unfortunately, that also is divided by our fiscal year, which is a little tricky for, getting assistance with, it's a limited number of hours that those positions have as well. So, want to dive a little bit deeper, but I promise I won't go any further than this because I don't like numbers all that much, and I think they get confusing. But I did want to point out that most of our complaints and cases are regarding junkyards and encroachments, with about 60% of the junkyards existing in the general use and LI zones. And so those are the ones where it's an allowed use, provided that it is screened from public view. So moving into the case studies, which are a little bit more fun. Is this an encroachment? Obviously, if you have a house in the middle of what is supposed to be the road, that's, later once the encroachment was removed. So, of course, this is the softball I'm throwing you of, yeah, that's an encroachment. This is a 100-foot right-of-way. Obviously, the road is not very big within that, but, guy's house in the road. But does get a little more complicated. I'm clearly not going to have you guys follow through this, but there was a code enforcement working group under the prior mayor that we did develop. We were trying to go over like, hey, this is, some of the code is onerous to get through for us. But I'm going to kind of walk you through a little bit on another one of, is this an encroachment? So a guy has a bunch of vehicles on the side of the road, including a dump truck, just your classic thing. And, that last one was obvious. It was in the traveled way. You have to, dart around it. This one, a little bit more challenging. So I thought maybe if we walk through that decision tree on this one. So, A, does it involve a structure, object, operation, or material? Yeah, it's cars, sure. Is it placed in, on, under, or over a public road? Well, yeah. So public road, you go to the definition, and yes, this is in the public road, even though the cars aren't going right on it. Is it placed in such a manner as to impair, impede, or obstruct proper use of the public road or area? Well, you can drive down the road, but the context here is that there's another guy who lives down the road who would like to actually expand the road within that right-of-way, and it's not in a road service area, so he could just go and take down the trees and put some gravel down and have a wider road. So let's call that a yes. Could it be considered a minor temporary object placed within the public road area? So the other context is these cars have been there for like 10 years, and so they're no longer minor temporary objects at that point. So yes, this is an encroachment, but that's not always clear. And if it is temporary, so somebody is just coming and parking, overnight or something, then we have to ask, is it within the traveled way, and is it obstructing the public use? So it definitely, you have to basically go, there's just so many parts of the code that can derail, going out and actually accomplishing something on these sites. We could potentially post it as abandoned vehicle, but even if we did that, we don't have any contracts in place to tow the vehicles. And it's also more expensive to tow oversized vehicles like the dump truck or semi-trailers or vans full of car parts or whatever happens to be out there. And there's a limited number of tow companies with that capacity. So here's another one showing some pretty liberal use of the public right-of-way. The guy actually put in a bunch of fill right next to the side of the road, make a nice flat area, and put a bunch of his personal property out there. There's no vehicles, just a bunch of his stuff. And so I'm not going to walk you through the decision tree this time, but I want to discuss some of the other challenges with enforcement or of encroachments. So this one is in a road service area, but the road service area is not concerned with it. They can still maintain the road. His stuff isn't out in the traveled way. The property itself does meet the definition of a junkyard, but it's been there for 40 years, and this is just a complaint we got this last year, and it basically had been under the radar until he decided to have his stuff all out next to the road. So let's assume that we know where the right-of-way boundary is, although we typically don't because we don't have a lot of surveys. The next question that comes to mind is, do we need to, so if we did go out and post all this stuff, or do we need to inventory all of those personal items in the right-of-way so they can go and get them in impoundment? And, how do we track that? And again, we don't have any contracts in place to take your personal stuff too. I mean, is this a guy with a van that comes in and picks up all the stuff? So some questions there. And then who pays if we were to do that? Because it is in a road service area, so traditionally road service areas would cover towing fees. But if they don't care, is that something that then, we step in and do pay for that as well? So the more fun one, obviously, is junkyard. So again, a kind of a softball as far as can you identify a junkyard? I mean, we live in Fairbanks. That's something we all know about, drive by. But, is actually putting it into the definition of a junkyard is certainly more challenging. Just a very simplified version of junkyard definition is 1,000 square feet of junk. We don't care if it's 20 acres or if it's a 5,000 square foot lot. There's no distinguishment in the code between those two things. You just get 1,000 square feet. And we also don't prioritize, if it's prohibited in the zone, it's in the middle of a residential zone, or if it is out in general use and just requires a fence. So here's one a lot of you are probably familiar with. Down just south of Eielson, across from the transfer site. Some of you probably received emails in the past about it, but strangely we didn't get our first complaint on it until 2017. And part of that was standing as well. So somebody was standing, had to file a complaint, and none of the immediate neighbors did that. It is a little interesting to see it from above, though. It does clearly meet the definition of a junkyard. It's over 1,000 square feet. And it should be easy to clean, right? Well, you might notice here that so these lines are not accurate. We always make that caveat. But can you guys, yeah, you can see my mouse. So, but there is a 300-foot right-of-way, technically an easement, but 300-foot right-of-way here for Richardson Highway. So actually, a bunch of the guy's stuff, not even on his property. So we just learned about encroachments, so it seems like, okay, well, we can post it as encroachment, right? No, we have no jurisdiction because it's DOT right-of-way, and so they maintain it, they're in charge of it. He actually used to have stuff even closer out to the road, so just the context too is from the edge of the road to the tree line's about 40 feet, and he used to have that all full of stuff as well, and I believe DOT did come by and have a conversation, and he did at least move it back so that they could maintain the road there. Little more context too, the owner's also been in jail since mid-2017, so that complicates it as well. And there actually was a prior enforcement action in 1989, and the guy's mom, it always seems to be the mom, like once you can get a letter sent to the mom and they respond, it never goes away. So still coming in to clean up after the mess. So they did, apparently spent like 50 grand and cleaned up all the stuff that was out there. Initially, it's taken, this long to get back to the point that it's at. They were required to have a fence, but, they put it out close to the road. that was interfering with DOT maintenance, so they had to remove the fence as well. That's according to the owner, so, I don't know. But, hey, cool, there's other owners for this property as well, so maybe they can be helpful, like the mom, so the mom, the wife, they come in, hey, we want to clean this up. We contacted some people, it's going to be like 10 grand to take it out. Hey, borough, are there any resources? Is there anything you can give us, any kind of carrots? And we were like, well, you can take it back across the street to the transfer site, and we can expect, more volume there. But other than that, we don't really have a lot of tools other than sticks to force people to do things. And so, we have some ideas for some of that stuff, but of course it brings into question, your use of the public funds. If somebody just decides they don't want to move stuff, where do you draw that line? So we could go out and get a court order and have things physically removed from the property, but again, that doesn't address the right of way. So, and it's also in general use. So they could actually just put up a fence and call it good. So it definitely is complicated. And I'm just going to show you one more. This is Junkyard 2012. That chose to expand a little by 2017. This is in the RA zone, so it's just prohibited, outright prohibited there. Owner estimated last year he had 125 vehicles out there. And there were also vehicles in the road, and they were definitely in the road. You could barely get by. Rural Services had tagged them, but I don't think any were towed. At least I'd never heard of any being towed out there, and that's ultimately the road service area's decision. If they say, well, we don't want to, use our funds to do that, then the cars just stay out there. It's clearly a violation in a zone where it's not allowed. We did a bunch of site inspections, sent letters. We even got a written cleanup plan, and they failed to comply with that. So this was actually the only one we've ever tried to issue a citation on. And I had some complications, to say the least. Beginning with delivery, the post office screwed up on their restricted delivery, let some random person sign for it kind of thing. And so, strangely, when you get it the second time, you're not going to sign for it. But we also had some internal roadblocks. For example, who do we issue the citation to when there's an out-of-state owner and a local guy who is leasing? So we had to develop a policy for that. What about after we issue the citations? Do we have a birth to grave plan for which cases are litigated and which aren't? And what are the criteria we use for that? So we still need to develop a policy for that as well. So on this one, feel like we kind of dotted our I's and crossed our T's, but we were still unsuccessful to this point. And you may think that I've just, really cherry picked these and found really rare cases, but that's not at all. These are just classic, the type of things that we deal with each one. So some of the good news is some of you may remember last year during the budget, we did request some money for a code enforcement cleanup project fund, and you guys graciously acquiesced a portion of that request. There was a $20,000 initial investment into it to provide funds for property cleanups when voluntary compliance efforts, including issuance of citations, have been ineffective and cleanups have been ordered by the court, and was added to include encroachment and abandoned vehicle removal. So again, some of you were in those meetings, but some of you weren't, so I just wanted to do a quick history on how we got to that point. So the legal department was justifiably reluctant to enforce junkyards. 2003, went to the assembly to try, we got a court authorized junkyard removal. The neighbors were going to put up 10 grand to help with that, and so the borough would just pitch in 20. And there was 8 years of litigation and Alaska Supreme Court decision. All of that culminated in, nah, we're not gonna give that money to you. We don't choose to pursue that anymore. So basically that, we put a big stop sign and said, we're not gonna do anymore. We're not gonna pursue those. That's a waste of borough resources. And so there have been no new injunctions since 2002. We do have some existing permanent injunctions, but even though they're permanent, they basically go stale at a certain point. One last bullet is not included in your packet, but this was then just last year in 2019 fiscal year, which was a typo on the prior one, that the $20,000 was invested. And just to put it in context, City of Fairbanks has about 17,000 annually. Used to be closer to 50,000. Mostly use it for demo of derelict buildings. But you may have seen in the newspaper last month that end of last month in ADN, they had an article about City of Anchorage, and it was a follow-up on a prior one they had. So they cleaned up a 2-acre junkyard that was their bane of existence down there, and it ended up costing $84,000. And I was noting how there were only 21 vehicles out there. Clearly, the guy had a bunch of other junk, but put that in the context of that one that I just told you about with 125 vehicles, and start to put it in perspective. That one had an original estimate of 50,000, and they were in litigation for 5 years, and so Anchorage is putting up more money into that fund. They had 200,000 this year, and they're putting another 100,000 for next year. But I mean, you also aren't spending that right away either. It does take some time to build into it. So you may be asking, all right, of that $20,000 initial investment, how much have we spent? We haven't spent any of it. So why is that? There's lengthy efforts with voluntary compliance. We pretty much try to do everything we can to accomplish that. There's limited resources, and guess what? More internal roadblocks. So we have some environmental uniqueness up here, as far as with the ground being frozen and all that, but we get all of our complaints right in the summer. And so part of that is the snow melts, people come back, they see, hey, all that crap next door is still there. And so that requires some seasonal assistance. We also, we're limited by weather. So just like you're limited, our short construction season, that also coincides with living the Alaska lifestyle. So a lot of people are doing projects, there's recreating, hunting, and they're not thinking about cleaning up their property. Also, during the winter, you can't put a fence in so if you're just required to put a fence up for screening, you can't do that in the wintertime when the ground's frozen. And also even just having items frozen to the ground. Then there's spring breakup and access issues and mud and all that. So, that's a challenge. But then we also still have those internal challenges as well. So there's a prioritization table that's also included in your packet. And currently it is too general, and everything is kind of a high priority, and it's not really limiting our limited resources. And especially for junkyards and encroachment, because you saw that half of our cases are junkyards and encroachment. So if we're supposed to be working on those, okay, so which of those are we supposed to be working on as well? But that's hard because, if you say, well, what's our most important ones to be working at? Well, okay, well, maybe it's the ones where it's prohibited in the zone. It's middle of residential zone. Those should be the ones that we're working on, but that's not usually the ones we hear about. It's usually the ones in general use where, people think it's a residential zone, but it's not. It's general use. And so it just, makes that challenging. And also, we still need to have contracts in place for tow trucks, including for removal of private property. And one of the lessons learned from rural services, they had a semi-trailer removed from a cul-de-sac last year, and they found out that we need to have more appeal language also in our code. So that's something that will be coming as a legislative action to get that in there. So right now we feel sort of paralyzed that we can't even tow the most egregious encroachments and abandoned vehicles. So, there are some roadblocks like the weather that we can work around, but there are other ones we're trying to break down individually. And my last one before getting to your questions is I feel like code enforcement and the community in general is at a crossroads. Sort of grow up or don't. What type of community do the citizens want? None of us want a police state, but we also don't want the Wild West. And the reality is, we don't have a team of officers going out and tagging vehicles and as you might think of, in context of other places. And so the expectations can't be the same for that. We do have limited resources, and there are trade-offs to that. So we can't do everything. We can go after the big fish. We could go after the low-hanging fruit. But going after those big fish takes way more resources. You just saw it took 5 years to go after that one junkyard for Anchorage. Whereas, if you go out and can tag a bunch of vehicles, you can make a lot more progress with that. So I would love to say it's strictly a manpower issue, and obviously that would help, but you could hire 10 more people and we'd still have some of the same roadblocks that we just need to work through. So we are working on those, but it is taking more time. But the clear things for me is that the status quo is not sustainable, and we will need to prioritize the caseload. And that will likely, that means that we would not be working on some of those lower priority cases. And, that means that there's going to be some folks that are displeased with that. And then they, come to you folks, or they come to the mayor about that as well. And so I just would ask that you keep some perspective in that when communicating with the citizens. And we're trying to figure out what's the best way to do that. Last two things are that the summer assistance is critical just to provide the bare minimum level of service. And we've tried to do the more with less and increase our efficiencies, and we've done a lot of that, but pretty much squeezed all the juice out of the apple here. So we are pretty much at this point restricted to, during the summertime, we're just getting such a volume of complaints that go out, we do a site inspection, we send an initial letter, and then, we work with the folks who respond and are willing to go through a voluntary compliance. We are having some struggle with that overlap that I was talking about with the fiscal year and how we juggle that position and the hours with it. But again, that's something for us. And so the last thing is with that cleanup fund, that it was a giant leap in some ways, but it was also a small step. And we've struggled to issue citations even with the most egregious violators, and that's a cultural shift here in Fairbanks. But, and so there's still some red tape we need to cut with getting to the point where we can actually issue the citations, but, we still just don't have funding to go after those big fish that we were talking about. So I am interested in any questions that you have. Kelly and I are both here for that, and I thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. So we will open it up for questions or discussion. First, I have Mr. Gray, and then Mr. Wojcicki, and then Mr. Cooper.
I have two questions, should be quick. First question is, can you send us those draft decision trees, or better yet, the presentation? Sure. It just would be interesting to see those, and it's kind of hard to see them from here.
Yeah, for sure.
And or without a magnifying glass here on this. Second question is, early on you stated that you have the power to initiate an action or a complaint or something like that, but you choose not to. Is there a reason why other than workload, or is there any reason not to get them on the list, or?
I'd say it's a little bit of both. So we do want to be responsive to the complainants, and it's really good to say, hey, where did this complaint? I want to see who complained, and then there is something that tracks it back, and it's not just somebody in a borough vehicle going out and I was going to a site inspection and I happened to see that thing over there.
True,
so.
but you might be the only one that knows about it.
Well, and also we're not dealing with a lot of life safety sort of
Sure,
stuff,
yeah.
So that makes more sense in the context of a building code.
Thanks.
Okay, Mr. Wojcicki.
Do you recall what is the status of the complaint on kind of far down in Alaska Way about encroachment of vehicles kind of parked over the property line onto the public right of way?
I believe that case was closed.
It wasn't reopened? I thought there was a neighbor who paid for a surveyor and brought you back new evidence that was pretty conclusive of the encroachment. Maybe he just brought the evidence to us and it didn't go to you.
I think there was some additional discussion of what is an encroachment, or what is within, could be stored along a building within setbacks and some stuff like that. But I do recall that we did address kind of each of those.
Okay, and I got another higher level question, not so specific. So I noticed at the first slide you cited the quote, "If you don't enforce the rules, then you're just giving advice." I think one of the gentlemen in the public here has emailed us with that basically summarizes his point. And so his suggestion, so I'm going to ask you if you think it'd be a viable strategy, is to get funding a little higher, particularly with either encroachments or junkyards. Go after 2 or 3 of the very worst offenders in the borough, publicize it, and kind of try to make an example. Does that seem like a good strategy from your point?
I certainly think it is something that we all would like to do. I think it is more complicated than that because, like that example that I used down on the Rich, that's a very visible one that I think a lot of people have in mind. But, you know, we have to balance where is that on the priority level as well. So
That's all for me.
The next I have Mr. Cooper, then Mayor Ward.
I didn't know if Mayor wanted to address that point. If you do, you can go ahead of me, but up to the chair.
Well, I'd just like to let the Assembly know in general, the policies that we're speaking about were policies the previous administration put in place. So this is something that's on the list. This is something that, I have not addressed with planning and zoning about how we're going to move forward with these things. So the policies that have been given, the direction that's been given to the department was from the previous administration. We just have not got to that yet, so.
Thanks. I think my comments and questions actually play off of both Mr. Lejeski and the mayor's comments. And as I'm listening to this, I guess I hear three things. There's three kind of impediments or roadblocks to code enforcement. One is kind of an internal administrative. You've got some issues there that you have to figure out. And maybe that direction will come from the mayor as he moves into his term. Two, it appears that there are some legislative things that this body can take care of in terms of appeals and perhaps other issues. Is that right?
yeah.
And do you have specific proposals for those legislative fixes, the things that this assembly can do in mind?
Interestingly, there was a prior, before the code enforcement working group, there was a junkyard task force, and they actually had some suggestions on, some of those things as well, and that could be useful.
I think going forward, it'd be helpful for this body to have those suggestions from you so that we can act on them, because it's hard for us, to make things up on the fly. But
if I could, I would just be cautious asking Mr. Semmel some of these big policy questions that would actually be things that would be, and I'm not just saying you, Mr. Cooper, I'm just saying in general, they're probably more appropriate to be directed to the mayor. I just don't want Mr. Semmel to be put on the spot on some of those. But there are some legal issues with code that have been identified and that we'll work on language for your consideration.
Thanks. And to be clear, I'm not just asking Mr. Semmel for answers. Anybody from the administration is welcome to answer these. I recognize I don't want to put you on the spot, and I want the mayor to be able to provide the direction he wants to for his administration. So anybody feel free to chime in response to my questions. I think the third one is really, and it's also an assembly question, is appropriation. It's a money question. And what I'm hearing is that you haven't spent money out of the junkyard cleanup fund, but and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the issues here may be manpower. So there's a couple money issues. One, how much do we have available to clean things up? And two, do we have money appropriated and FTEs designated for the job that needs to be done? Is that generally the gist?
Yeah, that's okay. I will say there are 3 code enforcement officer designations allowed by code, but even within that, even to find someone within the air quality division that was authorized to write citations was difficult within the context of job descriptions. And so it's difficult when you look at the penalty provisions, and they range from everything from hotel motel taxes and those parts of code that aren't complied with, to floodplain management, to Title 18 zoning. There's a really big variety of things, and so to find 3 people that each have expertise in that area of code and can write citations for it, I think is difficult. But Mr. Semmel has probably the broadest authority of the designated code enforcement officers that are there.
I guess I know Mayor's trying to pipe in, but I'll just leave with this last observation from what I'm seeing, which is that we've had several updates on code enforcement over the years, and we kind of get the same presentation, which is it's really hard, we're not making a lot of progress, we don't have the resources, we need to change things, but there haven't been solutions brought to this assembly that we can act on. And so as Ms. Dolan is giving me a skeptical
I'm not sure that that's completely accurate.
Well, I don't want to argue, but when as part of the budget process, we put money into the cleanup fund, and I know it wasn't as much as was requested, but that was, I think, the last time something that was an actual step that this body could take was before us. So what I would like to see is the administration take step and take shape and addresses this issue, is bringing some stuff to us that we can act on if it's appropriate.
Okay,
And,
next.
and Mayor, I don't know if you wanted to, you're trying to, if it's,
Yeah, point taken. As far as, some of the issues that we're looking at here, our fine schedule under general provisions, is quite long, and it does include quite a few titles in our code. And so it is correct that Brian does have probably the broadest range of ability to enforce that section. But again, there's such a variety. This is one of the things that I have on my list to address with this assembly on who actually enforces these things. It would be reasonable, I think, to expect folks that have expertise within those titles to be enforcing those titles. Unless we expect our code enforcement officers to be, kind of general encompassing of all departments, which has not generally been the practice that I've seen. So there's a lot to work on here, and I recognize that. And I do feel a little bit frustrated just because I haven't had a chance to really get my teeth into this yet. We've talked about it with the department in our meetings, and the communities definitely let me know that there's issues out there and how we're doing this. Quite honestly and frankly, I find it disturbing that we have so many things that are violations and we just choose to ignore them. And so I agree with the attitude that if we're going to have it, we should enforce it. That's my job to make that happen. So if there's an issue as far as policy that the assembly needs to be aware of, as I go through this process, I will be bringing that forward to this assembly.
thank you.
Okay, Mayor Ward, I had you next on the list technically. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add now?
That was it. Thank you.
Okay, great. So Ms. Sanford and then Mr. Tackey.
Mr. Cooper actually addressed some of the issues that I was going to talk about, but I'm wondering, where are we at with an ordinance adding appeal language? That was one of the roadblocks. Is that in draft form? Do we have something?
So that's just a fairly recent issue that came up with respect to abandoned vehicles and when we have ability to tow. We don't have a process in code for post-seizure due process hearing, essentially. And so while we can administratively do it, which is what we did in the last issue that came up, we should really clean up our code and have a codified process. And so I have a draft in my office that Mayor Ward has not seen. It's in a very rudimentary stage. I just have had it in the past few days, so.
And may I have another?
Yes.
And then, so I see several times that we talk about lack of resources and lack of money, and yet we haven't tapped into that $20,000 that has been sitting there. And I've written down that one of the first things that you mentioned we didn't have money for was abandoned vehicles and a contract to tow vehicles. Seems to me that $20,000 would be a great starting contract. We could start getting some of the, and maybe I am like totally jumping it at a surface level, but what's going on? We have a pot of money we're not using. We have easy enforcements that we could be making. What am I missing?
So the pot of money that you're talking about just came into the budget this past year. So it's only been in existence since July. But what code requires is that we follow the penalty provision in the citation process before we would then go into court actions and start doing a lot of things. And you're talking about a borough who has not done code enforcement since essentially 2002. And so before we were going to start citations and deciding where, some decisions really had to be made. We couldn't just start picking on people. I was worried about selective enforcement claims and things of that nature. So those are some of the policies that Mr. Semmel was referring to, that they kind of had to get their house in order. They had to prioritize why they were doing certain complaints, who they were going to cite, whether it was a tenant or an owner, things like that. What are we going to do when the owners live out of state? So a lot of those things have been in the works. I realize you don't see it all because a lot of it's happening on the administration side, but that has been getting worked out.
One final. And so when are we going to expect that? When are we going to start picking on people?
I don't have the answer to that part. I know there's certainly been letters and complaints and contacts with people, so they aren't getting to the level of my office yet, but I don't think there's been no act. I think code enforcement's actually been very busy from my understanding from my conversations with Mr. Semmel.
Go ahead, Kellen, if you want to respond.
Do you mind
to
if
that.
I just chime in a little bit? We are, as Mr. Zamel mentioned, we are working through some of the hurdles we have internally. We have been working on the draft language change that he already mentioned, as well as setting up kind of blanket contracts. So we expect by this next season, this next code enforcement season, if you will, we'll be able to have a more visible action. The second thing I wanted to add to that is it was just an unfortunate kind of alignment of personnel. This assembly gave us money not only for the cleanup fund, but a small amount of temp salaries to bring on a temp employee for the summer season. But we didn't get that money until July 1, and by the time we actually had to go out multiple times to get a qualified individual for that, and we were kind of already past the cleanup season, the complaint season. And I just want to point out that last year, I think it was just under 200 complaints. That's almost a complaint a day. So Brian, when he could be making progress with these property owners, was stuck in the office most of this summer taking complaints in, filing complaints. And now that we have that administrative type person set up as a temp employee, they can take the complaints, they can log the cases, they can create the cases to free up Brian's time to actually get compliance on a number of these cases. So we are hopeful, and you will see more progress in the coming seasons.
Next, I have Mr. Tacky.
Oh, nope.
No? Okay, sorry, I thought your hand was up, and Mr. Gray, if we could go.
Well,
to
I
Ms.
mean,
Williams.
yeah, just as a note, the concept of prioritizing projects, it's well, at least in this presentation, it's written as an administrative item, but I'm just wondering if perhaps that's at least a methodology of prioritization, maybe that would be worth considering codifying. I mean, I don't know if that would help protect against the appearance of selective enforcement like what you're talking about, but perhaps at least.
Those typically are administrative matters, not legislated.
Okay. All right.
Ms. Williams?
So in the quick glance I took at Borough Code, one of the things that's supposed to happen eventually is that if the borough has to clean up a code violation, that the person needs to pay back the borough for the costs. Does that ever happen? And what would the process be? And would that eventually, once we were up to speed enforcing code and fully staffed, would that help to be able to continue to deal with code violations?
I think it's probably most appropriate, Jill, if you answer the question with liens and.
So there's ways to get judgments to help fund the cleanups. I would say for the most part with properties that we've seen and looking historically, I think it's unlikely we'll recover a lot of that. But it's possible. So
Code says you should.
okay, so we haven't done that. So just so you realize, we haven't done any of this since 2002. So it's not like I have a history to look back on and give you some data on that. But yeah, the code says it, we would certainly pursue it. But whether or not, even if we obtain a judgment, if we can collect on that, it's possible. I don't know that code enforcement typically does not pay for itself. It's a cost of business. It's not something that you're going to typically replenish a fund with.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So next I have Mr. Quist, then Mr. Lejeski, and then Mayor Ward.
Thank you. So now that the air quality manager is no longer a designated code enforcement officer, does that mean we have the ability to designate another employee as a code enforcement officer?
There is the ability for the mayor to do that under code. We would have to find someone, we'd probably have to amend a job description, and so it would be something in addition to duties. There's not another FTE funded in order to designate them as a code enforcement officer.
And then the mayor can also act as a code enforcement officer, is that correct?
I believe so, yes. I don't know why he couldn't, but that's not typical. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Lejeski.
Oh, did you call me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was laughing a little bit. So, if the assembly gave direction, and I suppose perhaps it could be through resolution or code, that's what the attorney's for, but regardless, in the correct manner, that stated something along the lines that the assembly did not intend on addressing encroachment in road service areas and left it up to the road service areas, is that something that would help from your perspective as a code enforcement officer? Would that make your job easier at all, or?
Anything that makes it clear what I am and am not supposed to be enforcing makes my job easier.
Okay, so I'm hearing a yes from that. And then I've got another
Really,
question.
but, I mean,
But
it's really not an
I'm a
appropriate.
bias.
It's really not appropriate. So really what the appropriate thing to do is to make a decision as to what's going to be a penalty under borough code and what's not. And then administratively, they handle how the enforcement is going to happen.
So in other words, the borough or the assembly here, we could state in code that we're not going to address encroachment issues in road service areas and then delegate that authority to the road service areas.
So the road service areas are the borough. They don't have a separate legal existence from the borough. They are a separate taxing jurisdiction for purposes of dollars and funding, but they don't have a legal existence outside of us. So you could put in code perhaps that you don't do encroachments without recommendations from commissions. And you could have a process where a commission would have to make a recommendation on that, but they'd make the recommendation to the mayor and it would be the mayor's ultimate decision through his staff.
Ms. Major, could I request that Mr. Williams be able to speak? I think he's got something he's dying to say.
It was said, but I can make it simple. I mean, even if we put that language in code, Brian's still going to deal with it probably at some point because it goes through, the road service area commissions are still administered through administration. So Mr. Bradley or Brian or somebody on the staff's going to deal with it.
Okay, that's all for me.
Okay, so Mayor Ward.
Yeah, so a lot of what you're talking about is policy decisions that I think we can deal with within the administration. So, the other part of this too is, the thing that tends to be the most visible are the junkyards, but we have many other sections of code that require very little for resources that we're not enforcing. So, this is again, it comes down to this policy level decision that, and I have not had the chance yet to engage with staff on, but we have many other sections. One that came to my attention, I think, last week was illegal subdivisions. It's a violation of code. I think it's a $500 violation. We haven't enforced that, and I don't think we've ever given a violation out for someone that does an illegal subdivision. So there's a lot of things that we have in our code that we haven't enforced that potentially could be much easier to do from an administrative perspective and probably more responsible to do if we're going to actually enforce code than to go after junkyards. Now, I'm saying that to give it context, not saying that that's what at a policy level decision made at the administration would happen, but I have not had that opportunity to go down and have those conversations. So again, to give that context, there's a lot that we're not doing that we should probably think about doing before we go spend tens of thousands of dollars to clean up a junkyard.
Okay, thank you. Next, I have Mr. Gray.
Sure. So I hadn't made it to the end of the packet, and I saw this table of code enforcement priorities. This is actually what I meant. I wasn't sure if you thought maybe I meant specific projects of things to enforce, but I meant like types of enforcement actions, how those would be prioritized, which is exactly what this is. Is this table in code? I was just curious.
No, that's just an administrative.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Table, yeah.
Okay, Mr. Lejeski.
As far as, I guess, the nature of the complaints or the severity of them, I'm just kind of wondering if perhaps under the old standards for, and I don't know exactly what they were, but you described it as you had to initiate standing and it usually had to be a neighbor, and there was no, mispronouncing the word, anonymity to that. Someone wants to jump in there. Anyway, do you think that was giving you higher quality complaints that were more clear-cut violation? Like a filtering mechanism? Because what's going through my mind is maybe go back to the old one, just at least as a thought. It certainly cut down on the number of complaints, it appears, from the stats.
it certainly cut down on complaints, but we try not to focus on where the complaint came from. That's why we go out and independently verify it. Make sure, so, deflecting that back to, is this a violation of code or not?
So I guess another way is, do you get complaints sometimes that you feel are frivolous?
We just have to go out and do our own independent verification from that.
Okay.
Okay, are there any other questions or discussion, Mr. Tacky?
Mine would just be to point out to administration as well is that like the majority of our complaints and our caseload seems to be junkyards. And since that's like what our constituents are most upset about concerning code violations, I think we should put funding and effort into that. So I think that I would urge this administration to keep that as a highlighted point and also grab low-hanging fruit that might be out there as well, if there are code violations of that nature also. So I would be interested in seeing an opportunity to have another employee designated as a code enforcement officer and providing additional funding to help clean up junkyards, to let folks know you can't just have a junkyard. I mean, like it's the same deal, the very highlighted quote, if you don't enforce your rules, no one's going to listen to them, there's guidelines.
Okay, Mayor Ward?
So what I said earlier was to give it context. That's something that we can definitely address, I think, administratively, is if we're going to give priority to junkyards, as that's something that we've heard quite a bit about lately. And the Assembly's willing to fund that at the level appropriate to do that kind of work, then we can make that happen. I don't see a reason why we can't make that a part of that policy.
Okay, any other, Ms. Williams?
I'm still struggling with the violation process as it is right now. If you go out, somebody's given you a complaint, you go out, you say, oh yes, we go through the decision tree, it's an encroachment, and it's a violation of code, is that person then, you talk to them and they don't fix it, then is a violation issued? Do they get a fine? I mean, I'm looking at it and it looks like they should be, but...
So what would happen then is we would provide notice of the removal. So we have to give them, unless it's a hazard, we have to give them notice prior to the removal. So once that process plays out, then they could write the citation.
And are we currently writing citations? Is there an intermediate stage of letting people know that there's a big problem between doing nothing and paying $84,000 to clean up a junkyard?
So the way the process has been working, and maybe Mr. Zummel or Mr. Spillman wants to take this, but we give notice, we try and have conversations with people, and we try and obtain voluntary compliance. And so they actually have a process that they step through, citation being the last one. A lot of our citation, or penalties, I should say, require mandatory warnings. So we actually have to give formal warnings so we can prove in court that we've done that. My office hasn't been receiving citations, but we're ready to receive them. We have a code enforcement training manual. Ms. Billingsley trains the code enforcement officers. I mean, we're set up and actively working with them in order to do that. But there hasn't been active writing of citations, other than animal control, which I consider separate.
But if the administration chose, we could start issuing citations.
Correct.
Okay, any other questions or discussion? So I'll just add that I'm looking forward to hearing what the administration proposes for some changes, especially as we move into the budget process for the next fiscal year. So Mr. Spillman and Mr. Zummel, thank you so much. With that, I'd like to take a brief recess, if we could, maybe 5 minutes, returning at 7:39. Okay, I'd like to reconvene our December 6, 2018 Assembly Committee of the Whole work session. And next on the agenda is item 3, Advanced Ordinances and Resolutions. And 3A, ordinance number 2018-43, an ordinance rezoning Linda West subdivision, lots 1-2, Linda East subdivision, lots 1-2, Alice subdivision, lot 1, section 14, T1S R2W FM, GL-61W, GL-61E, GL-63, GL-64, GL-80W, GL-80E, GL-79N, GL-79S, GL-78A, GL-78B, GL-82W, GL-82E, GL-83W, GL-83E, GL-84A, GL-84B, GL-85 from General Use 1, GU1 to Rural Residential RR or other appropriate zone located on Roland Road and Linda Lane, west of Chena Pump Road, RZ 2018-006. The sponsor is Mayor Ward, and we do have a proposed substitute to ordinance number 2018-43, and that is removing items GL-64, GL-78A, GL-78B, and GL-85. The original ordinance can be found on page 3 and the proposed substitute on page 8. And Mayor Ward, if we could get a staff report, please.
Yes, thank you. We have Mr. Spillman with the Community Planning Department, as well as Mr. Singh, and then we have Ms. O'Neill from the Planning Commission.
Thank you, Mayor. Before I get into kind of the meat of this rezone, I want to point out the two ordinances in the meeting packet. The original ordinance is what the applicant requested. So that was the exact request from the applicant, and the proposed substitute is the recommended action from the Planning Commission. So there was a change from the recommended action that I'll get into throughout this presentation. This was an applicant-initiated rezone, and about 2 years ago, the Assembly put in the budget that applicants could get a free rezone application if they were going from general use zoning to a residential zone with certain parameters, and this rezone did meet those parameters. So a little bit of background, the general use zone is a pretty liberal zone in the borough. There aren't many things that are restricted in the general use zone. Multiple commercial operations are allowed there, industrial operations of varying degrees, as well as unlimited dwelling units. There are 1 acre lot size minimums, 1 nominal acre lot size minimums for general use, and that's what all these properties are right now, is general use. And they're being proposed to go to rural residential, which is a residential zone. It limits the uses to residential units, either a duplex or a single-family dwelling unit with the option of a conditional use for a guest house, but very few commercial operations are allowed there, almost no industrial type operations outside of home occupation type things. So again, it's a rural type residential zone with the 1 acre lot size minimums. So the location we're talking about today, it's off of Chena Pump Road, very close to the Chena River. It's at the Roland Road intersection. It's about 2 miles down Chena Pump Road. You can see it on the overhead view. This is a little zoomed in view of the properties. There are 22 properties in this proposed rezone, as you see highlighted in yellow here. Obviously, the intersection of Chena Pump Road and Roland Road. This is one of the busier intersections off of Chena Pump Road. There's approximately 1,000 vehicles a day that go down Roland Road. And the total acreage of the proposal, again, this is what the applicant requested, was 29 acres. As part of an applicant-initiated rezone, you need signatures. So an applicant must get at least 50% of the signatures from property owners to propose a rezone. So not everyone in the rezone area has to agree, but 50% do have to meet that threshold. And you can see in the overhead graphic, he got 65% of the required signatures and he needed 50. The green are signatures, properties that did support the rezone application, and the red are properties that did not support, that did not have a signature on the application. The current zoning, as I mentioned, it's general use 1. That's displayed in the gray up on the overhead slide. And the only other zone anywhere kind of in the near proximity is rural and estates 2. That's very similar to rural residential, with one of the main differences being it has 2 nominal acre lot size minimums, as opposed to the 1 nominal acre lot size minimums in the rural residential zone. But for the most part, all the property, the vast majority of the properties in the general area are general use 1. So what's out there right now? It is kind of a mix of uses. What you see up here on the overhead screen, I think this is important to note. I'm going to go through these one by one. The yellow is single-family residential structures. So the majority of the properties in the area have developed either as a single-family residence, or you see there in orange, there's 3 properties that have 2 dwelling units on them. But the majority of properties in the area do have dwelling units on them. There's a couple of vacant properties in there. You see those as the gray properties. But I think this is the really important note here. There's a few properties that, if this original request went through, that would become non-conforming. So you see those properties with multiple dwelling units. There's a 8-plex and a 5-plex, or 5 dwelling units on a property. Those would be non-conforming. So they would be legal non-conforming because the use established before the zoning changed, but this would put them as non-conforming. And particularly of note is the property right there at the intersection of Roland and Chena Pump. It's Siemens. That would become a non-conforming property if the request goes through as originally requested by the applicant. And the commercial uses are outlined in red up on the PowerPoint slide. I think it's very important to note that there are a lot of businesses along Chena Pump Road. While it isn't necessarily zoned commercial, the kind of main Chena Pump intersection there, the Chena Pump Plaza, that is zoned commercial, but most of the other businesses along the area, Pump House Restaurant, Siemens that I already mentioned, the boat shop, most of those are in the general use zone. So the number one tool, I mentioned this in my previous presentation, that guides land use, particularly guides zoning. It's in Alaska state statute as well as our Title 18 is the comprehensive plan. Our comprehensive plan for this area calls for it to be, quote, perimeter area. And one of the main emphasis of that is contains primarily residential uses. But I think one really important point to note here is the last time this land use map of this comprehensive plan was updated was 1990. So this has not been updated since 1990, this land use map in the area. And obviously this area has changed significantly since 1990. And I'll get into it a little bit later, but that was one of the findings of the Planning Commission. There's 2 criteria in our zoning code. Title 18 is our zoning code that rezones have to be evaluated on. And the first of those is that if they conform to the comprehensive plan. So in our staff report, staff did recommend approval of this based on that perimeter area was consistent with the requested rural residential zone. And the second finding is that it conforms to public health, safety, and welfare. And staff proposed some findings, again, based on the residential character of the area. The residential uses emphasized in perimeter area were consistent with the rural residential zone. And we did note that the lots abutting Chena Pump Road did have potential for commercial uses, while not necessarily identified in the comprehensive plan. So again, I want to point out up on the screen, these are the lots that were requested by the applicant. The Planning Commission held a public hearing on this and voted to remove 4 of the lots from the rezone. So the Planning Commission, I'll toggle back and forth a couple of times. This is the original request, and the Planning Commission voted to recommend approval with the 4 lots adjacent to Chena Pump removed from this rezone request. And a lot of this did come from some public testimony at the Planning Commission level. There was testimony against including these lots, particularly from the owners of the 8-plex and the owners of the business there, the Siemens business at the intersection. As far as public comments go, we sent out 229 Dear property owner letters to everyone within 2,000 feet of this request. We had 3 people at the Planning Commission, other than the applicant, give testimony. All of them were against the rezone. And I'm going to generalize with the 5 public comments we received via telephonic, 1 written comment. Most of the comments were against this rezone. So as far as Planning Commission action goes, the Planning Commission did vote to amend the request, as I already noted, to remove those lots, and then voted unanimously to recommend approval with those lots removed, and that's what's in the substitute ordinance. There are 6 findings of fact that are available in full on page 4 of your meeting packet. And I really would like Ms. O'Neill to talk a little bit about the Planning Commission findings and just the thinking in the meeting.
Thank you. Mindy O'Neill, Chair of the Planning Commission. First, I just want to congratulate the new members of the Assembly and the Mayor for being here today, and I look forward to your representation of the people of the borough. So we, as Kellen was saying, we heard testimony here mostly from the commercial properties along Chena Pump Road regarding the rezone. And the discussion was that the area has, when you look at the map of like the dwelling map, when you look at that map, you can see that the area has developed as residential, and except for along Chena Pump Road. And so our discussion was really like, well, if we're trying to match what's already happening there and make the code and the zones match what is actually happening, it would make more sense if we took out those commercial zones. And so that's how the discussion developed with the 4 lots or properties that we removed from the ordinance. We felt that it was a compromise from the people who had testified against the rezone, and the applicant, who felt that the area had developed as a residential area, and that with the rezone in the residential area, we were allowing the area to develop as residential, protecting the people who live there and live as a residential zone. There were some traffic considerations that we also considered. If we changed the lots that were coming up from Chena Pump Road, would that impact health, safety, and welfare? And then there was some discussion about the process of how the individuals were signing on to petition for this rezone. There was some conversation that it may not have been very clear to people what they were signing on to, and so that was a consideration that we weighed. And so with that, we made the amendment to remove those 4 lots, and that is what we have forwarded onto the Assembly for consideration.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Spellman and Ms. O'Neill. Mayor Ward, anything else to add?
No, just see the substitute for the recommendations from the mayor.
So that, next we have questions or discussion. Mr. Quist.
Thank you. Could you please toggle between the two slides here that show the 4 that you're omitting in the substitute? Okay. So I guess my question then is, so the property on the north side of Linda Lane, that's a one dwelling lot. The other, if I remember the other map correctly, and I guess that one. So like, I'm just curious what the logic is in omitting that from the proposed rezone, because the other 3 to the south of that seem fairly obvious why, but that one seems not to belong.
If you look at do you guys have the slides? If you look at the 4th slide and the owner signatures, that lot, that owner did not sign on to the petition. And so we decided to include it.
Thank you. So that also brings me kind of to another question I have. So of like the third of people in this rezone that didn't sign on to the rezone, of that third, I mean, if you just had to guess, like how many of those people didn't sign on to the rezone because they were actually opposed to it, or didn't do it just out of like indolence or sloth or something?
It's really hard to say, but when we asked the applicant, he said that he didn't have time to go to everybody.
So no, yeah, so it's not specifically to that property. I mean, I guess I was just thinking in general, like when people don't, so people are not, if I understand correctly, there's 65% of the people said affirmatively, yes, we'd like to rezone, but then 35% of people just didn't respond. And maybe not all 35% of those people are opposed to it. They just decided that they weren't excited enough to affirmatively. I guess maybe a different way to ask my question, if I may, is of that 35%, do you know, or could you speculate how many of those people are actually opposed to this rezone?
I'm going to defer that to Mr. Singh. He had the most contact with the property owners.
Thank you, Mr. Spillman. Based on my conversations with the neighbors and the applicant, there are a couple of vacant lots in that area, and the applicant mentioned that contacting the property owners of those vacant lots have been difficult. So I really don't know if, they definitely received a letter in their mailbox, but I don't know if they are supporting the rezone or opposing it. But definitely the businesses and the eightplex, they heard about the rezone process and decided not to sign it, and then also showed up at the planning commission meeting and expressed their concerns against the rezone process.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or discussion? Okay, Ms. Williams.
I realize that the boundary of the proposed rezone is what was proposed by the applicant, but it seems a little strange what is in the rezone and what is not. Was there any consideration, given that you were looking at the general area, of expanding the proposed rezone, or is that not how things are done?
We have to evaluate the application based on what the applicant puts in. And this is what his desired boundary was. We had a few pre-application meetings with him, expressing, some concern about the area. It might not be contiguous, that type of thing. And there were properties added to it after some pre-application meetings. A lot of conversation about if he wanted to or did not want to include the Siemens property. But ultimately, this is what he presented, and this is what we had to evaluate the application under.
I guess this is more a general administration question. When we're looking at rezones, it is driven by the desires of the applicant and not more broad desires to be in compliance with the comprehensive use plan?
A rezone can be initiated either by an applicant, most of our rezones are applicant initiated, or the administration can initiate a rezone. Any assembly member also has the ability to initiate a rezone. Excuse me. But from the administration point of view, we approach those a little bit differently. We did a very large one out in the Smith Ranch neighborhood, 131 properties with quite a bit of public process associated with that. It's usually a little bit different of a process than an applicant-initiated rezone.
Okay, any other questions or discussion? Excuse me. Thank you. Seeing none, that'll move us on to item 3B, ordinance number 2018-44, an ordinance authorizing the direct sale of a portion of Section 23, T.2N, R.1W, FM to a mining claim holder, Big El Dorado Creek. The sponsor is Mayor Ward, and more information can be found in your packet on page 102. And Mayor Ward, do you have a staff report?
Yes, thank you. We have Ms. Sandra Mota here from Land Management for the report.
Good evening. In October of this year, Mr. Stanley Stenberg formally applied for the purchase of a 40-acre parcel of borough-owned land. It's shown on the front slide there as the red square. The description at this time, it is unsurveyed land, so the adequate part description at this time is the northwest quarter of the southwest quarter of Section 23, Township 2 North, Range 1 West, Fairbanks Meridian. It's in the Big El Dorado Creek area, and this is located just south of the Old Murphy Dome Road, which you see running here along the top of the slide. It's north of Fairbanks there, the red dot, in terms of location. The parcel requested for acquisition is a portion of a half-section tract that the borough owns, which it acquired by patent from the state of Alaska in 1981. So if you see here, all of the hatched in green are borough-owned properties in this area, and this is the half tract from which the sale parcel would be extracted. The north half of the section here is owned by the University of Alaska, and they were contacted, adjoining property owners were contacted. They were potential bidders for the sale. They declined to bid for the property. The access to the property is through RS 2477 Trail number 1596, which is the El Dorado Creek Trail. That's the loop, the purple loop you see around. Your access would be there. This is a public right-of-way. It's dedicated public right-of-way, and Mr. Stenberg understands that if the property were sold, that he would not be able to preclude public access through the trail. So the parcel intended for sale corresponds to mineral claim 665498. This claim is owned by Mr. Stenberg. He, in fact, holds all of these claims here in our half section, as well as a number of them going down south on the RS 2477. Mr. Stenberg posted this claim in 2008, which is a qualifying factor for the purchase. If you may recall, in code we specified that anyone who had an interest in borough land, be it lease or mining claim, would have to have had it for at least 4 years to qualify for the direct sale. Mr. Stenberg will be here next week, and he's very excited to speak with you and explain to you the family history. These claims were, the discovery date on these claims go back to the early 1900s, and his family has a long history with this land, which is why it's a very personal request for him more than a business or economic development per se. The land itself, as you can see on the top right-hand screen there, so this is a shot from the comprehensive plan, which Mr. Spillman spoke to a bit here ago for other reasons. This is just one of the planning tools we might use to see what kind of land use we would attribute to this property. It's classified primarily as outskirt area to which mining is an appropriate use, and the northwest corner of that and all the area to the north of that, as you can see by the big orange swath, is high mineral potential. So it's a high mineral land use there. Sorry, GU1 is the zoning in that area, predominantly all the gray that you see there on the bottom left photo. So rezone prior to sale was not a consideration because it's consistent with the area as is. So this is another planning tool in our arsenal. It's the Land Suitability Analysis Report, the primary focus of which is basically to evaluate the physical capability of the land for development. It takes factors into consideration such as soil conditions, slopes, natural hazards, wetlands, and then it creates a matrix for giving a rating, as you see there on the legend, you know, most capable for development to least capable for development. So as we can see by the swath there of land here, this is generally less capable, least capable for development. Basically all of this to say that this is an area that would not likely be a candidate for the borough to subdivide itself and create residential lots for auction sale. Just another aerial shot of the area. So this would be the sale parcel would be here. I apologize, it's not shown in red. And this is the Big El Dorado Creek area. This is that trail, the RS-2477 trail that loops around. So as proposed, all costs associated with the platting action to create that 40-acre parcel would fall to the buyer. The sale price is fair market value with an additional 10% of fair market value as we had discussed and created in code. We would offer financing requiring a 10% down payment and a 10-year term deed of trust to the borough as beneficiary. And we've proposed the interest rates at, you see on the ordinance, 4.25%, which is what we would add on top of the federal discount rate of 2.75%. So what that means is code says we have to use the federal discount rate, which at this time is 2.75, and we wanted to aim for a 7% annual interest rate, so we tacked on 4.25%. These shots, just for informational purposes, the two top ones are the land itself. The bottom ones show the access. So the one on the right bottom there is the access from Old Murphy Dome Road, and then it goes into the trail, the RS-2477 trail that you see there on the left. That's a shot very close to the property. And that pretty much concludes the staff report. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, Mayor Ward, anything else from the staff report? So we'll move on to questions and discussion. Mr. Lejeski.
Right, so you're using the federal treasury, 10-year treasury note as the base and then adding on to that?
So Borough Code says that we will use the Federal Reserve discount rate, and our district is associated with the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. So that rate right at this time is 2.75%. And then code also says that we can add to that anywhere from 2 percentage points to 6 percentage points. So it could be as high as 8.75. We chose and discussed 7% as a way to stay competitive in the market at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any further questions or discussion? Okay, Ms. Williams.
Do we need to fix the typo on line 60? which lists the incorrect presiding officer.
That would be
We'll
appropriate.
just change, you don't have to fix that. That will just get changed when we sign. It's because when it was forwarded to the assembly, she was actually still the presiding officer.
Okay, any further questions or discussions? Okay, seeing none, that will bring us to item 3C, ordinance number 2018-45, an ordinance amending chapter 21.28 Fairbanks North Star Borough Code regarding air quality control program. Fairbanks North Star Borough Code 1.20.080 fine schedule and chapter 4.12 Fairbanks North Star Borough Code regarding air pollution control commission. The sponsor is Mayor Ward. Additional information can be found on page 107 in your packets, as well as in additional information is available in the yellow folder. Mayor Ward, can we get a staff report?
Yes, we have Mr. Nick Zarnecki from the Air Quality Division for the report.
Thank you. The ordinance that you have in front of you is to complete the legal requirements due to the passage of Proposition 4, which prohibits the borough from regulating home heating devices. And the ordinance is quite lengthy, so I'm not going to go through a line-by-line review of the ordinance for you tonight. But what I will do is give you a broad view of what the Air Quality Division will be doing moving forward and what programs have been removed. I would like to note that some of these were legal requirements and some of them were policy decisions. And so the programs that will be continuing forward include the wood stove changeout program. It's a very popular program, and right now we're working on appropriating the latest grant, which is a $4 million targeted airshed grant to continue the program. The borough will continue with forecasting and posting AQI, which is the air quality index, along with a health statement on the website. This is just a weather forecast type of forecast, and it is not, it's not connected to the alerts and the burn bans in any way. The Air Quality Department will also continue the neighborhood monitoring program. This is where we have several low-cost monitors that are distributed throughout the borough, primarily at elementary schools, to be able to notify the public, and especially those young sensitive receptors that are at the elementary schools, what the air quality is doing in real time. That data is displayed on our website and available to anybody in the public. And the borough will continue with an education and outreach program as well. Discontinued programs include complaints and compliance. The borough will no longer be receiving air quality complaints. Those will be going to the State of Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. The borough will no longer be running any compliance programs associated with air quality, including the curtailment program or burn bans, and also several of the other items in code, such as opacity restrictions and things like that. The curtailment program will be taken over by the Department of Environmental Conservation, and that has already happened. The mobile monitoring program, also known as the sniffer program or the hotspot guidance program, has been discontinued, and the borough is no longer issuing air quality alerts. Those are the alerts that are associated with the curtailment program and the burn bans. As a result of the reduction in the services that the Air Quality Department provides, a like-kind reduction in staff has been made. Of the 9 air quality staff before the vote, that has been reduced down to 4 full-time employees, so 5 air quality staff have been let go. And with that, that concludes my staff report on the general status of the air quality program, and I will pass it back to Mayor Ward if he wants to make any additional comments.
Yes, thank you, Nick. You do have the recommendations from the Air Pollution Control Commission that did review this. There was one change there was one typo in there. There was the word coal that should be wood, but I think we've got that sense figured out. One of the things that I want to emphasize on some of the decisions to, some of the policy decisions, if you will, not to continue with a voluntary type of program, which is some of the discussion that we had heard, was that it would be confusing to the public if we had a voluntary program and the state had a required program. So even if we left in the policy or the mechanisms that we had in place for the stage 1, stage 2, and made them a voluntary program, something like that, they're still mandatory under state law. So even if you didn't do it under our voluntary program, you still had to do it under state law. Otherwise, you could be cited. So that was some of the methodology on why a lot of that language, because I know there's a lot of long hours and late nights that went into that ordinance that put those things in there. But that's the mechanism. That's the reason why that language was removed. So that's all we have.
Okay, so Mayor, that completes your staff report?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And so open it up for questions or discussion. Mr. Quist?
Thank you. So what you were just referring to, the alert program that's being removed, the voluntary one, would that be an example of something that is being removed that's in addition to the legal requirements? And if so, is that more or less the only thing that you're doing kind of above and beyond the requirements of Prop 4?
No, so the question was, could that be made a voluntary program, which would not necessarily fall under the Proposition 4 because it wouldn't be mandated under Proposition 4 requirements. And so that particular part, I guess the Assembly could decide to have a voluntary program, but it would be, at least it was the administration's position, it would be confusing to the public to have a voluntary program here and a mandatory program under the state. One of the other things that isn't necessarily part of the ordinance, but was part of implementation, is the mobile monitoring, or the sniffer vehicles. I don't think they necessarily like them being called that, but we had 2 vehicles. One of them was the mobile monitor. One of them was used for enforcement, and so it was believed that, at least the administration's position is that since we are no longer in that business of enforcing, that could be viewed by the public as a form of enforcement. We still do have the stationary monitors that we have out at the schools that are located across the community, so we still have some good data that we're able to share. That's long-term, 24-hour data, but we just wanted to make sure that the public was fully aware that we are not in the enforcement business anymore.
Just if I could follow up, so like more generally, so the hotspot program, the mobile monitoring, is that the only thing that is not required to be removed from code or practice by Prop 4 that we're removing? I guess my question is, what are we going above and beyond and getting rid of that we're not legally required to? Mr. Zarnecki mentioned that there's some things that we're changing our policy that we're not required to. I guess, what are we changing that we're not required to?
So I believe those 2 things. Is there anything else, Mr. Zarnecki, that you're aware of? The other thing, to make sure that it's all understood, and the attorney could probably give a little bit of backup on this one if I get it wrong, but technically we don't have to do anything to our code because the proposition's law. But in an effort to make our code actually understandable for the general public that looks at it and wants to know what is law, what's not law, that's part of the mechanism. That's part of the exercise that we're going through today. So there's some of the stuff that it doesn't matter if we take it out or don't take it out. It's still a matter of law because the proposition was approved. So,
thank you.
Ms. Williams?
I've got a couple of questions about specific choices that were made in the ordinance. One question is starting on line 815, section 4.12.110, on powers and duties. You're cutting sections that talk about whether the Air Pollution Commission can make recommendations for air pollution provisions, and then in section D, investigating nuisances related to or caused by air pollution. this seems like a broader choice than would be required by the provision of the Home Heating Reclamation Act, since air pollution is a bigger problem than just stuff that is related to solid fuel heating devices.
So that area in particular, those were functions that the Air Pollution Control Commission currently is not doing, even prior to Proposition 4. I think there's also some language in there on building code and review. And so at least I'm not aware of the methodology. I think it's been in there since for a long, long time, but the commission's never engaged in that activity. Does, Ms. Dolan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, it's my understanding they haven't been doing that. And then as far as the investigating nuisances and health hazards, that's really related to enforcement, but that they weren't an investigatory body. They were typically an advisory body to the administration. And then after changes that had been made to code, they started acting as a quasi-judicial body for appeals and things from variances and no-ash denials. And so those requirements of code went away with Prop 4, so those duties went away as well.
The second question that I had is actually specifically with the section 21.28.070, the new section on the Home Heating Reclamation Act. Is it possible that section B got inserted in the middle of the definitions? Or is this the way it came?
I'll refer to the attorney on that one.
Yeah, so the way that's actually how it is submitted in the proposition and the initiative ordinance. They actually have their own section of definitions, and then they have a section that says, you know, we shall not in any way do these things. And so it didn't really matter which was A and which was B. They're separate sections in the initiative ordinance. We just made one an A and one a B.
But 4 through 9 in the ordinance were attached to B? It's weird because it goes 1 through 3.
Oh, no, that's a, I feel like, wait a minute. Did it print wrong?
Something weird happened.
Oh, you're right. I wonder if it printed wrong. I'll find out.
Can we fix it?
Yeah, we can. That's clerical. I don't know how that happened.
And
yeah, let me find out what happened there. The only thing I can think of is that somehow I don't know. I don't know how that happened. We had a administrative person that was supposed to just copy exactly what was in the initiative into code. So I'll find that out.
And I guess my third question is, if I can keep going.
So strange.
Yes, thank you. Is sort of philosophical. A lot of hard work was done in preparing the ordinances as they currently stand. And I don't anticipate that the problem of air quality is going to go away. It may be that in the future we will have different things that are passed. Is there a way to keep the language in the ordinance from disappearing out of our recorded memory? I mean, ideally, I would just keep the language that's in the code and say this was repealed. But are there ways? That's clearly not the approach the administration is taking. Are there other ways to keep the language?
So that is a little bit of the approach that was taken. So if I can refer you to page 2 of the ordinance, if you go, for instance, to line 38 with prohibited acts, that's actually showed as repealed. So instead of renumbering the whole section and losing it, it's actually going to be identified as repealed. But we never truly lose the history of the ordinance. So when you look in our code book and you see the history, it will show you the history of ordinances. So we can always go back to the specific ordinance and pull that language and reinsert it. It doesn't get lost.
So all the language that is in caps and bracketed will still be in the history?
Yes. Yeah, so the ordinances that actually enacted all of that will still exist. And then, of course, this ordinance, which shows the deletions, will still be in the record, and the clerk's office maintains those. Yep.
So just to clarify, though, the code version that you pull up, if you click on the web, the current version on the web, though, will not include that language that's been deleted.
Okay, further questions or discussion? Okay, seeing none, thank you, Mr. Zarnicki, and that will take us to item number 4, briefings from the Borough Mayor.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I've been trying to stay awake because I've been up since midnight. I just got literally just got back in from DC at 5 o'clock, so I'm a little bit disoriented just from being up so late. So a couple things that I wanted to talk about. There is an amazing event going on that we're partnering with CCHRC on, and it's the Architecture in Extreme Environments. This is going to be happening on Monday, December 10th from 6 to 8 p.m. at the Nolene Library. And just a little bit of explanation of what this is. Architecture students from the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts in Denmark are spending this month at Cold Climate here in Fairbanks working on new approaches to cold climate architecture and design. And the mayor's office, we had an opportunity to go over there with some staff this last week, I think. Yes, last week. And had lunch with them to talk about some of their projects. And they're really a great group of folks. They've done some phenomenal work as part of their coursework. They've actually come up with some of these prototypes that they're working on. It's their project. And then they had, as part of their class, they had to do an infographic on different aspects of Alaska. And so they have some of these amazing pieces that they've done that talk about our community and about the Arctic and the interior that we really thought would be it'd be a great thing to show and share with the community. And so I have to give all the credit to Brittany in the mayor's office. She pulled all this together because I was out the door as this all happened. If you get a chance to come in and meet these students, they're really phenomenal. And they've got some there's a parka made of pine needles. And it's the idea is using renewable local resources to come up with an insulation technique. I don't know if it worked terribly well, but it was really great in concept, and they did a lot of good work on that. So I encourage you to come out on December 10th for that. Tomorrow is the second Muffins with the Mayor here at the Fairbanks North Star Borough. It's at 11 o'clock at the Children's Museum. If you get the opportunity to come, it'll be great. They are going to let folks in for free during that period of time, that 12 o'clock to noon hour. So if you want to bring the kids and come, my wife did make muffins. She texted me this morning, how many do I need to make? So we've got at least, I think, a couple dozen, and encourage you to come down tomorrow if you get a chance. And then also, talking about my trip, I did have an opportunity to go down to speak at the Wilson Center to give a local perspective of a community in the subarctic, to really talk about Alaska and what it's like to be up here. It was really interesting to be in that position and hear generals and academic folks and politicians talking about Alaska and about the Arctic and about our community. Some of them have never been up here. And so I felt like it was a really valuable experience to go down there and share with them from a local perspective. And then I also did have an opportunity to meet with our congressional delegation to talk about air quality. And so I hope to have some more reports on that. I had high hopes. I think that there is still reason to have hope for some flexibility to help bring us into attainment. But I had a really sobering conversation with one of our senators where they said, you had 10 years to work on this, and where are you? And so that was a bit of a difficult conversation that I had to have. But like I said, I literally just got back a couple hours, I guess a few hours ago now, and I'm looking forward to going home. So that's all I have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mayor Ward. And so that'll take us to item 5, Assembly Business and Comments. And we'll start with Mr. Tacky.
I don't have a comment this evening, thanks.
Okay, Ms. Lake.
No comment.
Mr. Gray.
None for me.
Hey, Ms. Sanford. Mr. Lejeski.
guys look at the schedule and things in the pipeline, there are a number of different ordinances that all can chip away at the deferred maintenance problem. And I'm excited. They're coming from different people, different sources, different backgrounds, and yeah, I'm excited to see what comes of them.
Ms. Williams.
I have no comments.
I have no comment, thank you.
Mr. Cooper.
Oh, I won't delay the mayor's return home, so no comments.
Mayor, I think everyone was feeling the same as you tonight, ready to go home. So I'll just remind everyone that Thursday, December 13th is the next regular assembly meeting at 6 p.m. in the Mona Lisa Drexler Assembly Chambers. And it is 8:29, and the meeting is now adjourned.